Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Hobbit by J.R.R Tolkien. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. In a quiet corner of Middle-earth, in the gentle, rolling hills of the Shire, there lived a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. Hobbits were small folk, half the height of a grown man, with round bellies, curly hair, and an inclination toward peace, comfort, and hearty meals. Bilbo was no different. He resided in a luxurious hobbit hole called Bag End, with a perfectly round green door and a warm, well-stocked pantry. Life was predictable and peaceful, and that was precisely how Bilbo liked it. He had no desire for adventures were messy, inconvenient things that took one far away from second breakfasts and afternoon tea. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One fine morning, as Bilbo stood outside smoking his pipe, an old man with a long gray cloak, a pointed hat, and a staff in hand appeared on the road. The stranger was none other than Gandalf the Grey, a wizard of great renown. Though Bilbo had heard tales of him, he never expected to meet the legendary figure himself. Gandalf, with a twinkle in his eye, greeted Bilbo and spoke of an adventure, one that he believed the hobbit would be quite suited for. Bilbo, horrified at the very suggestion, politely refused and excused himself. But Gandalf was not so easily dismissed. He marked Bilbo's door with a mysterious symbol before leaving, setting the stage for an unexpected turn of events. The next evening, a company of 13 dwarves arrived at Bilbo's home. One by one, they knocked at his door, first Dwalin, then Balin, then Fili and Kili, followed by Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin, then Bifur, Boffer, and Bomber, and finally, their leader, Thorin Oakenshield, a proud and noble dwarf with a long history of hardship. They made themselves quite comfortable, filling Bilbo's dining room with laughter, song, and an alarming amount of food consumption. Confused and flustered, Bilbo soon learned the reason for their gathering. Thorin and his company were on a quest to reclaim their homeland, the Lonely Mountain, from the dragon Smaug. Long ago, the dwarves had been driven from their kingdom of Erebor by the monstrous beast, who now lay atop their vast hoard of treasure. Gandalf, believing Bilbo capable of more than he himself realized, had chosen the hobbit to be the company's burglar. Bilbo was baffled. He had no experience in burglary or in adventuring of any sort. He lived a quiet life, free of peril and danger, and had every intention of keeping it that way. Yet, despite his reluctance, there was something enticing about the idea of seeing the world beyond the Shire, something thrilling about the dwarves' tale of lost kingdoms and great battles. However, before he could make a decision, Thorin and the others finalized their plans. A contract was drawn up, stating Bilbo's share of the treasure, 1/14 of whatever they might reclaim. Overwhelmed and uncertain, Bilbo found himself swept up in their adventure before he could object further. The next morning, Bilbo awoke to an eerily quiet house. The dwarves had gone, leaving behind only the remnants of their feast. A wave of relief washed over him. Perhaps they had realized their mistake and decided to proceed without him. But just as he was about to settle back into his routine, Gandalf arrived, urging him to hurry. With no time to gather his belongings or second guess himself, Bilbo dashed out the door, beginning the most unexpected journey of his life. Their path took them eastward, through green fields and over hills. And though the company made good progress, Bilbo soon realized how ill-prepared he was for such a journey. The nights were cold, the food was scarce, and sleeping on the ground was far less comfortable than his feathered bed at home. The dwarves, though not unkind, did little to make him feel like one of their own, often doubting his usefulness. Even Thorin, whose pride was a force of its own, seemed skeptical of the little hobbit's abilities. Before long, their first true test arrived. As they traveled through a dense forest, they came upon a clearing where 3 large, grotesque trolls were gathered around a campfire. These were no ordinary travelers. They were monstrous, ill-tempered brutes, speaking in harsh, grumbling tones as they argued over their meal. The company knew that facing them head-on would be a fool's errand, and so, reluctantly, they sent Bilbo forward to prove his skill as a burglar. Nervous and inexperienced, Bilbo crept toward the trolls, hoping to pickpocket one of them. But things did not go as planned. He was caught almost immediately, and before he could explain himself, the trolls had him dangling upside down, questioning what to do with him. The dwarves rushed in to help, but they too were overpowered. One by one, they were captured, stuffed into sacks, and placed before a roaring fire. The trolls, debating whether to roast, boil, or eat them raw, could hardly contain their excitement. But just when all seemed lost, a familiar voice echoed through the clearing. Gandalf, ever the cunning trickster, had returned. Using his magic and wit, he imitated the trolls' voices, tricking them into arguing amongst themselves until dawn broke. The first rays of sunlight turned them to stone, for trolls, as it was known, could not endure the light of day. With their captors vanquished, the company searched the trolls' camp and discovered a hidden stash of weapons and supplies. Among them, Bilbo found a small dagger, though for a hobbit, it was practically a sword. Thorin claimed an elegant, elven-made blade, which would later be known as Orcrist, the goblin cleaver, while Gandalf took another, which bore the name Glamdring, the foe hammer. With new arms and renewed determination, they pressed on. The road ahead promised even greater dangers, for their journey was still in its infancy. But for the first time, despite his many doubts, Bilbo felt the slightest flicker of excitement. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was not entirely unsuited for adventure. The company pressed forward into the wild, leaving the stone trolls behind. Bilbo, though still wary of his role in this grand adventure, carried his new blade at his side, a small but significant reminder that he was no longer just a quiet hobbit from the Shire. The discovery of the troll horde had lifted the spirits of the company, and Gandalf, always mysterious in his ways, seemed particularly pleased with their new weapons. However, their path would only grow more perilous from here, and before long, Bilbo and the dwarves found themselves at the edge of the Misty Mountains. The towering peaks loomed ahead, their snow-capped tops lost in a sea of swirling clouds. The road became treacherous, winding through steep passes and narrow ledges. The company had hoped for a safe route through the mountains, but nature had other plans. As they climbed higher, dark clouds gathered above them, and soon, a fierce storm broke loose. Thunder roared across the sky, and lightning flashed like jagged spears of fire, illuminating the craggy cliffs in eerie bursts of light. The wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of strange voices that seemed to come from deep within the mountains themselves. Seeking shelter, the company stumbled upon a cave in the mountainside. It was dry and spacious, offering respite from the storm. Grateful for the find, they settled in for the night, taking turns to stand guard. Yet, despite their caution, they were not alone. Deep within the cavern, something stirred. Bilbo, who had grown restless, awoke with a start. A strange sound reached his ears, something like the scraping of stone on stone. Before he could react, the cave floor yawned open, revealing a hidden passage beneath them. From the darkness poured a horde of goblins, grotesque creatures with twisted limbs, sharp teeth, and glowing eyes. They fell upon the company with cruel laughter, overwhelming them before they could draw their swords. In an instant, the dwarves and Bilbo were captured, dragged deep into the mountain's core, while Gandalf was nowhere to be seen. The goblins hauled their prisoners through a labyrinth of tunnels, leading them to a vast underground chamber, where an enormous goblin, the great goblin himself, sat upon a crude throne of bones and iron. His eyes gleamed with malice as he leered down at the intruders. The goblins jeered and prodded the dwarves forward, eager to hear their leader's judgment. Thorin, ever proud, refused to cower, but the great goblin recognized him at once. "Thorin Oakenshield," he sneered, "son of Thrain, son of Thror, what brings you to my halls?" Thorin offered no answer, but the goblins had already found Orcrist, the elven sword he carried. At the sight of the blade, the great goblin shrieked in rage. He recognized it as an ancient foe of goblins, a sword that had slain countless of their kind in battles long past. "This is an enemy's blade," he bellowed. "You shall all pay for this trespass." The goblins advanced, their weapons raised, and Bilbo, still bound, felt his heart sink. But just as doom seemed certain, the chamber was flooded with blinding light. A deep, commanding voice rang out, followed by a deafening crack. Gandalf had returned. With a stroke of his staff, he sent the goblins reeling, their cries of pain echoing through the cavern. The great goblin barely had time to react before Gandalf struck him down with a flash of steel, ending his reign in a single blow. Chaos erupted as the remaining goblins scattered in terror. Seizing the moment, Gandalf freed the company, and together they fled through the tunnels, pursued by the furious goblin horde. Their escape was perilous through twisting paths and narrow bridges, with goblins nipping at their heels. Yet, by some miracle, they found an opening in the mountain and burst into the night, tumbling down the rocky slopes beyond. They were free, but Bilbo was missing. Unbeknownst to the others, Bilbo had been separated in the goblin tunnels. As he stumbled through the darkness, he lost his footing and fell into a deep cavern, landing hard on cold stone. He was alone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. And then, from the shadows, something moved. A small, pale creature with bulging eyes and thin limbs crept forward, barely making a sound. His name was Gollum. He had lived in the depths of the mountain for longer than anyone could remember, surviving in the dark, whispering to himself, clutching a strange golden ring. When he saw Bilbo, he did not attack outright. Instead, he spoke in a hissing voice, proposing a game of riddles. If Bilbo won, Gollum would show him the way out. If he lost, well, Bilbo did not wish to think about that. The game began, and though terrified, Bilbo matched Gollum riddle for riddle. "What has roots as nobody sees is taller than trees, up, up it goes, and yet it never grows," Bilbo answered, "a mountain." Gollum grinned and countered, "This thing all things devours, Birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Time. The answer was time. The game continued, but Bilbo grew desperate. As he fumbled for another riddle, his hand brushed against something cold and round in the darkness. Without thinking, he slipped it into his pocket. Gollum, suspicious and growing impatient, realized that he no longer had his most precious possession, his ring. Panic consumed him. He shrieked in fury, accusing Bilbo of theft. The Hobbit, still unaware of the ring's true nature, fled. Gollum pursued him, but Bilbo, in his haste, slipped the ring onto his finger and vanished. The ring was no ordinary trinket. It was a thing of great power, forged in an age long past. It granted invisibility to its wearer, and with it, Bilbo evaded Gollum's grasp. He followed the creature through the winding tunnels, unseen, until at last he found the exit. Emerging into the night air, Bilbo rejoined the company, who had feared him lost. They did not ask how he had escaped, and Bilbo, still unsure of the ring's power, chose not to tell them. But something had changed. He had faced danger alone and survived. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of confidence. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was more than just a burden on this journey. Yet, even as they left the misty mountains behind, danger still lurked ahead. The wild was vast, and far greater perils awaited them. But Bilbo, with his hidden ring and newfound resolve, was no longer quite the same hobbit who had left the Shire. His adventure had truly begun. The company had barely escaped the misty mountains with their lives, and the experience left them weary and on edge. Bilbo, though still shaken by his encounter with Gollum, remained silent about the strange ring he had found. He had discovered its power in the tunnels, how it allowed him to vanish from sight, but he did not yet understand its significance. For now, it was his secret, a small thing he kept tucked away in his pocket, like an ace up his sleeve. As they descended into the foothills, the landscape around them changed. The rocky slopes gave way to forests and rolling plains, and the air grew warmer. But they had no time to enjoy the scenery. The goblins they had escaped from would not forget their trespass, and their pursuers would not give up so easily. Worse still, there were other creatures in the mountains that hunted by night. Their first warning came with the howls. At first distant, then closer, an eerie, bone-chilling sound that sent a shiver down Bilbo's spine. Wolves. But not just any wolves. These were wargs, massive, intelligent beasts with shaggy gray fur, yellow fangs, and eyes that burned with malice. They did not roam the wild alone, for they were allies of the goblins. The company had no choice but to flee, scrambling up the gnarled trees of a dense forest as the wargs circled below. Thorin and the dwarves cursed their bad luck, for they knew that if the wargs had found them, the goblins would not be far behind. The creatures prowled beneath the trees, snarling and snapping at the trunks, waiting for the right moment to strike. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, another sound pierced the night. A great screech, high and wild, echoed across the sky. From above, dark shapes appeared against the stars, giant eagles. Their wings spread wide as they descended upon the clearing. These were the great eagles of the Misty Mountains, noble creatures of ancient wisdom. With powerful talons, they swooped down, seizing Bilbo, Thorin, and the others, lifting them high above the snarling wargs below. Bilbo clung desperately to the eagle that carried him, his stomach twisting as they soared through the night air. The wind rushed past his face, and below, the forest stretched endlessly into darkness. The eagles flew far, far away from the danger of the wargs and goblins, finally setting the company down upon a high, rocky outcrop where they would be safe until morning. Though grateful for their rescue, the dwarves were restless. They were still far from their destination, and the road ahead remained uncertain. But Gandalf, ever mysterious, assured them that help was near. He spoke of an ally who lived nearby, a skin changer named Beorn. The next day, the company made their way to Beorn's home, a great wooden hall that stood alone on the edge of a vast forest. Beorn was no ordinary man. He was a shapeshifter, a being of incredible strength who could take the form of a massive bear. He was also not fond of uninvited guests. Gandalf, knowing the importance of first impressions, introduced the company to Beorn in small groups, telling their tale bit by bit, drawing the skin changer's interest with each detail. By the time all 13 dwarves and Bilbo stood before him, Beorn had been won over. He provided them with food, ponies, and guidance for the road ahead. More importantly, he warned them of what lay before them: Mirkwood, a vast, dark forest, thick with twisted trees and crawling with strange creatures. It was the only path eastward to the lonely mountain, but it was not a path to be taken lightly. If they strayed from the road, they would be lost. With Beorn's gifts and his warning fresh in their minds, the company pressed on. They rode until they reached the very edge of Mirkwood, where Gandalf, to their dismay, announced that he would be leaving them. He had other business to attend to, though he did not say what. Without the wizard, the company would have to rely on their own wits to make it through the forest. The moment they stepped beneath the canopy of Mirkwood, the world seemed to change. The sunlight was swallowed by the thick tangle of branches above, casting everything in a dim, greenish glow. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The path was narrow and winding, and as they ventured deeper, the silence became oppressive. No birds sang, no wind rustled the leaves. Only the distant sound of unseen creatures moving in the undergrowth reminded them that they were not alone. Days passed, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The food Beorn had given them began to run low, and with each passing hour, the weight of exhaustion settled upon them. The enchantment of Mirkwood was unlike anything Bilbo had ever known. It clouded the mind, making time itself feel strange and uncertain. The path twisted and turned, and more than once, they found themselves doubling back without realizing it. Then, hunger and desperation got the better of them. One night, they saw strange lights flickering in the trees, a warm, golden glow like firelight. Against Thorin's warning, they followed it, drawn toward the hope of food and company. But the moment they stepped into the light, everything vanished. The fire, the figures they thought they had seen, all disappeared in an instant, leaving them in total darkness. Then came the laughter, soft, distant, and mocking. They had stumbled into the realm of the wood elves. Though the elves of Mirkwood were not evil, they were wary of trespassers. Led by their king, Thranduil, they captured the company and brought them to their underground halls. The dwarves, proud and unwilling to explain their mission, were thrown into prison. Thorin, in particular, refused to speak of his quest, for he held a deep grudge against the elves. Bilbo, however, was not captured. Using his magic ring, he slipped unseen through the elven halls, watching and listening. Days passed, and he knew he had to act before the company's quest came to an untimely end. That was when he discovered the barrels. The elves, as part of their trade, sent barrels of goods floating down the river, out of their kingdom and into the lands beyond. It was through this unlikely means that Bilbo devised their escape. One by one, he freed the dwarves from their cells and stuffed them into barrels, sealing the lids before pushing them into the river. It was not the most dignified escape, and the dwarves protested loudly once they hit the rushing water. But there was no other way. Bilbo, slipping into a barrel himself, rode the current out of Mirkwood, leaving the elven halls behind. The river carried them far beyond the forest, and when they finally emerged, cold and bruised but free, they found themselves near a great lake. Before them stood a town built upon the water lake town, or Esgaroth, the last stronghold of men before the lonely mountain. Their journey was not yet over, but for the first time, the mountain itself was within sight. The lonely mountain. Erebor, the home of Smaug the dragon. Bilbo swallowed hard. The true danger of their quest had yet to begin. The company of Thorin Oakenshield, weary from their long journey, had finally escaped the perils of Mirkwood. Soaked, bruised, and shivering from their journey down the river in barrels, they stumbled onto the shores near the Great Lake, where a wooden town stood upon the water. This was Esgaroth, or Lake Town, a trading settlement built upon wooden piers and platforms, connected by bridges and crisscrossed with canals. It was a place of men, governed by a master who ruled more by cunning than by strength, and who, like many in his town, had heard the ancient tales of dwarves and dragons. As they approached, Bilbo found himself marveling at the sight of the town, its wooden houses with their lantern-lit windows, the smell of fish and fresh timber in the air, the sound of merchants and water lapping against the pilings. It was a place of life, a stark contrast to the dark silence of Mirkwood. But for Thorin and his company, it was more than just a stopping point. It was the last outpost of men before their long-awaited goal, the Lonely Mountain. Though they arrived in poor condition, their arrival did not go unnoticed. A small group of men, led by a sharp-eyed captain, spotted the bedraggled travelers and brought them before the town's master. The master of Lake Town was a shrewd and calculating man, more concerned with wealth and power than with ancient prophecies. But the people of Esgaroth, unlike their leader, remembered the old legends. For years, they had spoken in hushed voices of Thorin's line, of the exiled king who would one day return to reclaim his homeland. When Thorin stood before them and declared himself the heir of Thror, rightful king under the mountain, a murmur ran through the gathered crowd. And when he spoke of the treasure of Erebor, of the riches that lay beneath the lonely mountain, their excitement turned to outright cheers. To the people of Lake Town, Thorin's quest was not just a tale of revenge against the dragon Smaug. It was the promise of prosperity. If the dwarves succeeded, Erebor would be restored, and with it, trade would flourish once more. The master, ever the politician, saw the growing enthusiasm of his people and decided it was in his best interest to support Thorin's cause. He provided the company with supplies, fresh clothing, and even ponies to hasten their journey north. But not everyone in the town shared the excitement. Among the people of Esgaroth was a man named Bard, a grim-faced warrior and a captain of the town's guard. He was descended from the men of Dale, the ruined city that once stood before the gates of Erebor, destroyed by Smaug when he first came to claim the mountain's treasure. Unlike the others, Bard did not celebrate Thorin's arrival. He was skeptical, warning that disturbing the dragon could bring ruin upon them all. But his caution was drowned out by the cheers of the townsfolk, who saw only the promise of gold and glory. After a few days of rest, the company departed, heading northward toward the mountain. As they left the town behind, Bilbo felt a growing sense of unease. The excitement of the people of Esgaroth, the grandeur of Thorin's proclamations, it all seemed too bold, too certain. The lonely mountain loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding. Somewhere beneath that mountain, a dragon slept. And Bilbo, for all his adventures so far, had never faced anything like a dragon before. As they drew closer, the land changed. The green fields gave way to barren, rocky slopes. The river wound its way through the desolation, its waters dark and still. This was the land of Smaug's wrath, a place where nothing grew, where the air itself felt heavy with the memory of fire and destruction. At last, they reached the foothills of the lonely mountain, and there, Thorin led them to an old, abandoned outpost, a place once used by the men of Dale, now little more than crumbling ruins. From here, they would begin their search for the secret entrance, the hidden door that would lead them inside the mountain. Days passed as they scoured the mountainside. Thorin, fueled by determination, searched tirelessly, refusing to believe that their journey had been in vain. But the mountain was vast, and the entrance well hidden. As frustration mounted, Bilbo found himself wondering why he had ever agreed to this quest in the first place. He had survived trolls, goblins, spiders, and elves. But now he stood at the edge of something far greater, something ancient and terrible. Then, at last, a discovery. High on the mountainside, hidden beneath an outcropping of rock, they found it the door. It was smooth and unmarked, blending seamlessly with the stone around it. Only a narrow ledge led up to it, making it nearly impossible to find, unless one knew where to look. Thorin ran his hands along the stone, as if he could feel the weight of history pressing against it. This was it, the entrance to Erebor. But there was a problem. There was no obvious way to open the door. No handle, no keyhole, no sign of how to pass through. The company was baffled. Thorin, growing impatient, ordered them to search for another way in, but none could be found. As the days dragged on, doubt began to creep into the hearts of the dwarves. They had come so far, only to be stopped at the very threshold of their goal. Bilbo, watching the growing tension, said little. He was no warrior, no leader, but he was clever. And so, he did what he had done many times before, he observed. He recalled the map they had studied long ago, the words of Thorin's grandfather, the cryptic message about standing by the gray stone when the thrush knocks. And so he waited. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set, Bilbo heard a faint sound, the tapping of a bird against the rock. He looked up and saw a thrush, pecking at the stone near the door. The setting sun cast long shadows across the mountainside, and suddenly, as if in answer, a narrow beam of light struck the rock face. The stone shimmered, revealing a small keyhole that had been hidden in plain sight. Thorin, his hands trembling, reached for the key. It was the very key his grandfather had left behind, the key to Erebor. Slowly, he inserted it into the lock. A deep, echoing sound rumbled through the mountainside, and then, with a whisper of ancient stone, the door began to open. Beyond the threshold lay darkness, the vast and unknown depths of the mountain. The air that flowed from within was stale, heavy with the scent of old gold and something else, something dangerous. The company stood in silence, staring into the abyss. This was it. And then all eyes turned to Bilbo. "You must go in," Thorin said, his voice firm. "You are the burglar. This is what you were hired for." Bilbo swallowed hard. He had known this moment would come. Yet now that he stood before the entrance, with the weight of the mountain pressing down upon him, he felt very small indeed. But there was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, Bilbo stepped forward, vanishing into the darkness of the dragon's lair. Bilbo stepped cautiously into the darkness of the lonely mountain, each step taking him further from the safety of his companions and deeper into the dragon's lair. The tunnel before him was vast and sloped downward into blackness, its air thick with an ancient, musty scent. The walls were smooth and cold beneath his fingers, and with each hesitant step, the silence pressed heavier upon him. He had never felt so small, so utterly alone. Yet he pressed on, knowing there was no turning back. The dwarves waited anxiously at the entrance, whispering among themselves. Thorin had sent Bilbo ahead because he was the burglar, the one chosen for this very task. But even he could not suppress the unease that gnawed at him. The mountain was filled with a terrible presence, something vast and deadly that had slumbered for years, but was never truly gone. Bilbo, gripping the hilt of his small sword, Sting, as he had named it, moved forward until he caught sight of a faint glow in the distance. It was not the light of the sun nor of any torch, but something more sinister. It pulsed and flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. And then, as he crept closer, the tunnel widened into an enormous cavern, so vast that its ceiling seemed lost in the dark. And there, at the heart of the chamber, lay the dragon, Smaug. The great beast lay coiled atop a bed of gold, his vast, scaled body stretched across the mountain of treasure. His hide was red gold, his wings folded like vast leathery curtains, his long tail curled around gleaming gems and piled coins. His head, crowned with wicked horns, rested lazily upon his hoard, and from his nostrils came steady bursts of smoke. Beneath his closed lids, Bilbo could see the faintest flicker of fire. Even in sleep, Smaug was terrible. His mere presence filled the chamber with an overwhelming sense of power and ancient malice. Bilbo's breath caught in his throat. Never had he beheld such wealth, jewels of every color, goblets and plates of gold, weapons, crowns, and chains, all heaped together in an endless display of riches. The sight was intoxicating, but the danger was greater. He knew he had to be careful. He had to be quiet. Slipping the magic ring onto his finger, Bilbo vanished from sight. The power of the ring filled him with a strange confidence, and with careful, silent steps, he moved closer to the hoard. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of a golden cup. Slowly, he lifted it from the pile, hardly daring to breathe. It was a small thing compared to the vast treasure before him, but it would be enough to prove to Thorin and the others that he had succeeded. Bilbo turned to leave, moving as quickly as he dared. But as he did, a shift in the air made him freeze. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber, and a voice, low, slow, and dripping with menace, spoke. "Who dares to steal from me?" Bilbo turned in horror. Smaug's great head had lifted, and his enormous golden eyes had snapped open. They burned like molten fire, scanning the chamber with deadly precision. Though the ring kept Bilbo hidden, Smaug's keen senses were not so easily fooled. The dragon sniffed the air, his forked tongue flicking out as he caught the faintest trace of something unusual. "I smell you, thief," Smaug murmured, his voice rolling through the cavern like distant thunder. "I hear your breath. I feel your little heart quivering in the dark." Bilbo, heart hammering in his chest, knew he had only moments to act. He did not dare flee, not yet. Instead, drawing upon all his wit and nerve, he spoke. "I am but a mere traveler," he said, his voice carefully steady. "A wanderer from distant lands. I have heard tales of the mighty Smaug and wished to see if the legends were true." Smaug let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "Flattery will not save you, little thief, but you are bold to speak to me, and that amuses me." He shifted, sending cascades of gold tumbling down his hoard. "Tell me then, who are you?" Bilbo hesitated. He knew better than to reveal his true name. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "I am the Barrel Rider," he said, thinking of his escape from the elves of Mirkwood. "I am the Luck Wearer, the Ring Winner. I am he who walks unseen." Smaug's eyes narrowed. "Ah, a riddler are you?" he mused, intrigued. "A trickster." His great head lowered toward the invisible hobbit, sniffing again. "But what brings such a one into my halls? Do your masters send you to claim my treasure?" Bilbo had to be careful. He could not risk leading Smaug to Lake Town or revealing Thorin's quest. Instead, he continued his riddling speech, speaking in half-truths and evasions. But as he did, he observed the dragon more closely. Smaug, in his arrogance, stretched and shifted, displaying his vast, armored body in the dim light. His scales were like polished shields, impenetrable and gleaming. But then, as Smaug turned, Bilbo saw something, a bare patch beneath his left foreleg, where no scales covered the dragon's flesh. A weakness. Bilbo's mind raced. This was crucial. If they were to have any hope of defeating Smaug, they needed to know this. But he had lingered too long. The dragon's amusement was fading, and suspicion flickered in his burning eyes. "You test my patience, little worm," Smaug growled, his vast wings rustling. "You will not escape my halls alive." Bilbo felt his courage shatter. His riddle game had run its course, and now it was time to flee. Turning on his heel, he bolted toward the tunnel, his heart pounding in his chest. Smaug roared, and in an instant, a torrent of fire erupted from his jaws. The heat was unbearable, the very air igniting around him. Bilbo barely made it to the passage before the flames engulfed the spot where he had stood. He ran, stumbling through the dark tunnels, feeling the heat of the dragon's wrath at his back. When he finally emerged into the cool night air where the dwarves waited, he collapsed, gasping for breath. "What happened?" Thorin demanded. Bilbo, still shaken, looked up at him. "Smaug is awake," he said, "and he is angry." The company fell into uneasy silence. The dragon was roused, his fury rekindled, but Bilbo had learned something of great importance. "There's a weakness," he whispered. "A bare patch on his chest, no scales." Thorin's eyes gleamed. This was news that could change everything, but there was little time to celebrate. From deep within the mountain, a deafening roar echoed across the night. Smaug had awakened, and he was coming. The mountain trembled as Smaug's fury shook the halls of Erebor. Deep within his cavernous lair, the dragon roared, his voice echoing through the tunnels like rolling thunder. The intruder had escaped, but not without leaving behind a sense of unease. Smaug was old and cunning, and he had not survived for centuries without recognizing when something was amiss. He did not fully understand who had come into his hoard, but he knew one thing: his treasure was being threatened, and that could not be allowed. Outside, the dwarves huddled together near the secret entrance as Bilbo recounted all he had seen. Thorin's eyes burned with determination as he listened to the hobbit's words. A weak spot in Smaug's armor. It was an opportunity, perhaps the only one they would ever have. But what could they do against such a creature? They had no great armies, no weapons strong enough to pierce dragon hide. The realization sent a chill through them all. Even as they debated their next move, Smaug was already putting his own plan into action. He knew now that these intruders were not mere thieves. They had a purpose, a connection to this mountain. He had heard the riddling words of the Hobbit, words that hinted at men, at barges, at a place beyond the mountain where people still lived. And in his arrogance, Smaug believed he understood exactly where his enemy lay. With a monstrous beat of his vast wings, Smaug launched himself from his hoard. The force of his movement sent cascades of gold and gems tumbling like rivers of fire through the chamber. His red, golden body gleamed in the moonlight as he rose from the mountain, his vast shadow darkening the slopes below. With another mighty roar, he turned southward, his mind filled with thoughts of fire and vengeance. Down below, Thorin and his company were unaware of Smaug's departure. They sat near the door, still discussing their next move, when Bilbo, his keen hobbit senses tingling, looked up toward the darkened sky. Something felt wrong. The mountain had gone silent, too silent. Where was the dragon's growl, the glow of his fire within the tunnels? Then Bilbo's breath caught in his throat. The distant night sky, once clear and starry, now flickered with something terrible. A fiery shape, vast and monstrous, was streaking through the heavens, heading southward toward the long lake. "Smaug," Bilbo gasped. "He's gone." The realization hit the company like a thunderbolt. Smaug was not waiting for them in the mountain he had left, seeking vengeance elsewhere. And in that moment, they all knew what the dragon intended. He was flying toward Lake Town. Panic seized them, but there was nothing they could do. Lake Town was miles away, and Smaug would be upon it before they could even reach the foot of the mountain. The thought chilled Bilbo to the bone. He had spoken of barrels and water in his riddles. Had the dragon misunderstood? Did Smaug think the men of Esgaroth were responsible for this intrusion? There was no time for regret. If Smaug had truly left the mountain, that meant Erebor was unguarded for the first time in centuries. It was an opportunity as well as a tragedy. Thorin, seeing the moment for what it was, turned to the others, his voice urgent. "Now is our chance. While the dragon is away, we must go in. The treasure of our fathers lies within, unguarded." The dwarves hesitated only a moment before following their leader through the secret door and into the darkened halls of the mountain. But even as they rushed inside, Bilbo lingered for a brief moment at the threshold, his heart heavy with unease. He had seen what Smaug was capable of, and he could already imagine what would befall Lake Town. Far to the south, Lake Town stood quiet beneath the moonlight, its wooden buildings casting long shadows upon the water. The people of Esgaroth had heard the old tales of Smaug, but many believed he would never come. They had lived for generations in the dragon's shadow, yet he had remained in his mountain, distant and terrible, but far away. But Bard, the grim-faced captain of the guard, had never forgotten the stories. He had watched Thorin and his company depart with wary eyes, and now, standing on the watchtower, he felt a deep foreboding settle upon him. Then came the roar. It was not the sound of the wind nor the crash of waves upon the lake's shore. It was something deeper, something older, a sound that reached back into history and sent terror through the hearts of men. The people of Esgaroth looked up, and what they saw filled them with despair. Smaug was coming. A streak of fire split the night sky as the dragon descended, his vast wings beating against the air. He came like a storm, a force of ruin, his eyes burning like twin suns. As he swept down upon the town, he opened his jaws, and the first torrents of flame erupted into the night. The wooden walkways and houses ignited in an instant. Smoke billowed into the sky as the town erupted into chaos. People screamed, running toward the boats, desperate to escape the inferno. The master of Lake Town, ever the coward, scrambled to save his own wealth, ordering his guards to carry away his treasure rather than help the people. But amidst the panic, one man stood firm. Bard. He had long prepared for this day, though he had prayed it would never come. As his people fled in terror, he took up his great yew bow, the heirloom of his ancestors, and climbed the highest tower that remained standing. His keen eyes followed the dragon's path, searching for something, anything, that might give him a chance. Smaug, in his arrogance, swooped low, reveling in the destruction he had wrought. He did not fear the men of Lake Town. Their arrows bounced harmlessly from his diamond hard scales. Their spears could not pierce his hide. He was fire, he was death, and they were nothing to him. But Bard did not give up. As the flames raged around him, a voice reached his ears, an old thrush, fluttering near his shoulder, chirping urgently. Bard frowned, listening. It seemed to be speaking, though not in words he could understand. Yet something within him, some deep ancestral instinct, understood its message. A weak spot. Bard's mind raced, remembering the tales of the old dragons slaying kings of Dale. The thrush's cries guided his gaze to Smaug's belly as the dragon wheeled above the town. And then, there, beneath the beast's left wing, a bare patch, a single spot where no scales covered the flesh. Drawing a deep breath, Bard notched his final arrow, a black arrow, forged long ago by the men of Dale, passed down through his family. He whispered a prayer to the old kings, to his father, to all those who had perished under Smaug's fire. And then, as the dragon roared once more, he let the arrow fly. It struck true. The arrow buried itself deep into Smaug's unprotected flesh, piercing his heart. For a moment, the dragon's wings faltered. Then Smaug let out a sound unlike any before, a shriek of agony, a cry that shook the very heavens. He twisted in the air, his vast body writhing, and then, with a final, terrible scream, he fell. Smaug crashed into the lake, sending a great wave surging over the burning town. His body sank, steam rising as the last embers of his fire hissed into darkness. And with that, the great dragon, the last of the mighty fire drakes, was no more. Lake Town lay in ruins, but against all odds, it had survived. Bard, the dragon slayer, stood amidst the wreckage, his face grim and weary. The people gathered around him, murmuring his name. And as they looked to the mountains in the north, they knew that change was coming. For the dragon was dead. And now, the true battle for the treasure of Erebor was about to begin. The dragon was dead. His terrible roar had faded, and his burning wrath was quenched in the dark waters of the long lake. But those Smaug's reign of terror had ended, his death sent ripples through the land, awakening greed, ambition, and strife among those who now sought to claim his treasure. Far from Lake Town, high in the halls of Erebor, Thorin Oakenshield stood amid the vast wealth of his ancestors, his fingers running over the cold gold and gleaming jewels. No longer did he think of the dragon. His mind was filled with something else, the Arkenstone. The heart of the mountain, the pride of his house. It was here, hidden somewhere among the endless piles of treasure, and he would not rest until it was his. The company of dwarves wandered through the great halls, their torches casting flickering light upon the once glorious kingdom of Thror. Gold spilled across the floor in endless rivers. Chests overflowed with silver and gems of every hue. Armor, weapons, crowns, and relics of a long-lost age lay forgotten under the weight of dragon-hoarded wealth. It was a sight beyond imagination, enough treasure to make each of them wealthier than the kings of old. But none of them dared to take too much, for they sensed a change in Thorin. His eyes gleamed with something unsettling, something possessive, as he gazed upon the hoard. Bilbo, standing apart from the others, felt uneasy. He had never cared for treasure, but even he could not deny the grandeur of Erebor's wealth. Yet the mountain felt heavy with something unseen, a shadow, a sickness that clung to the gold. He saw it in Thorin's face, in the way the dwarf lord ran his hands over the treasures with growing obsession. "We must find the Arkenstone," Thorin declared, his voice firm. "It is mine by right. It is the heart of this mountain." Bilbo did not know why, but he hesitated. Deep within him, a voice whispered caution. And then, as the dwarves searched through the hoard, his hand brushed against something smooth and cold. The Arkenstone. It was unlike any gem he had ever seen. It shone with an inner light, a soft radiance that seemed to come from the depths of the stone itself. It was as if it held the very essence of the mountain within it, a fragment of the dawn, the brilliance of the stars trapped in crystal. And in that moment, Bilbo knew that this was what Thorin sought above all else. But he did not reveal it. Something told him, some deep instinct, that to give Thorin the stone now would be dangerous. The king's mind was already clouded with thoughts of gold and power, and this jewel would only tighten that grip upon him. Bilbo, unnoticed by the others, slipped the Arkenstone into his pocket, his heart pounding. He did not know why he had done it, nor what he meant to do with it, but something told him it was the right choice. For days, the company remained in the mountain, reinforcing the old gates and halls, preparing for what was to come. For Thorin knew that word of the dragon's death would spread, and many would come seeking a share of the hoard. He would not allow it. This treasure, this kingdom, belonged to the dwarves. None would take it from him. His suspicion grew. He sent out messengers, summoning his kin from distant lands, calling upon the armies of the dwarves to come and aid him in holding Erebor. He did not trust the men of Lake Town, nor the elves of Mirkwood, whom he knew would soon arrive. His heart hardened, his mind darkened, and he paced the halls of his ancestors, thinking only of the wealth he had reclaimed. Meanwhile, far below the mountain, in the charred ruins of Lake Town, the survivors gathered. The town was lost, its wooden walkways and houses reduced to ash. But its people were not broken. Led by Bard, the dragon slayer, they salvaged what they could and began to rebuild. Bard, though grim and weary, was now a hero. The people looked to him for leadership, and even the master of Lake Town, ever the coward, dared not stand against him, but they were in desperate need. They had lost their homes, their food, their supplies, and Bard knew where aid could be found. The treasure of Erebor lay unguarded now, its its dragon slain. Smaug's hoard was vast beyond measure, and part of it rightfully belonged to the people of Dale, whose city had been destroyed by the dragon long ago. Surely Thorin would see reason. Surely he would share a portion of the wealth to aid those who had suffered. But Bard did not trust to chance. He sent word to Thranduil, the elven king of Mirkwood, who had long watched the lonely mountain from afar. The elves, swift and well-provisioned, moved northward, their banners bright against the winter sky. They brought food, supplies, and aid to the suffering people of the lake. And as Bard stood upon the shores, looking toward the distant peak of Erebor, he knew that he must go to Thorin and speak for his people. The host of men and elves set out for the mountain, marching through the long, ruined valley of Dale. They came not as enemies, but as those seeking what was fair. Yet when Thorin saw them from the high walls of Erebor, he was filled not with gratitude, but with fury. "They come to steal what is mine," he growled. His hands clenched around the hilt of his sword, and his voice carried through the halls like a storm. "They think me weak, now that the dragon is gone, but I am king under the mountain, and I will not be robbed of my birthright." Bilbo, standing near, felt a chill run through him. Thorin's obsession had grown worse. The gold, the Arkenstone, the power, it was all consuming him. When Bard and Thranduil arrived before the gates of Erebor, they sent forth a messenger under a banner of peace. Bard stood tall before the mountain, his voice steady as he called out, "Hail, Thorin Oakenshield. We come not to steal nor to make war, but to speak in reason. The dragon is dead, and we have suffered greatly. Will you not share a portion of the gold, that your neighbors may live?" But Thorin's reply was cold. "I will not be bargained with," he declared. "This gold is mine, and I will not part with it, not a single coin." Bard pleaded with him, speaking of the destruction of Lake Town, of the people in need, of the old alliances between dwarves and men. But Thorin's heart had turned to stone. He would not yield, so Bard gave his final warning. "We do not seek to take by force, but if you will not aid us, we will not allow this wealth to be hoarded while others starve. We will not leave." Thorin, in his growing madness, took this as a threat. He ordered his companions to bar the gates to fortify the mountain. He sent out ravens, calling upon his kin. The dwarves would come, he was sure of it. His people would answer his call, and together they would defend what was rightfully theirs. From the heights of Erebor, Thorin watched as Bard and Thranduil set up camp before the mountain. He gripped the hilt of his sword, his thoughts filled with suspicion and wrath. There would be no peace, not while he still breathed. And Bilbo, standing in the shadows of the great halls, felt his unease deepen. He knew then that the real battle had only just begun. The days stretched on, and the tension outside the lonely mountain grew heavier. The forces of men and elves remained camped in the valley of Dale, their banners fluttering in the cold wind. They made no move to attack, but neither did they depart. Their presence alone was enough to deepen Thorin's paranoia. He paced the halls of Erebor, his thoughts consumed by suspicion and gold lust, his fingers tightening around the hilt of Orcrist. He would not be swayed. He would not be robbed of his birthright. Inside the mountain, the other dwarves began to grow uneasy. They had reclaimed their home, but this was not the victory they had imagined. Instead of feasting and celebration, there was fear, anger, and the heavy weight of impending war. Thorin ordered the main gate to be further fortified. Stones were piled high, and every entrance but the front was sealed shut. No one would enter Erebor without his consent. Bilbo watched this transformation with increasing concern. He had seen Thorin change over the journey, but now the dwarf lord was becoming someone else entirely. His words were filled with bitterness. His eyes burned with greed. He spoke endlessly of the Arkenstone, swearing that he would find it, that it belonged to him and no one else. Bilbo, who had the great gem hidden away in his pocket, felt its weight grow heavier with each passing day. He did not know what to do with it, but he knew one thing: if Thorin found out that he had it, there would be trouble. Then, one evening, the sound of trumpets echoed through the valley. From the north, banners of blue and silver appeared upon the horizon, glinting in the pale light of the sun. A great host of dwarves marched forward, their axes gleaming, their armor heavy with the symbols of their ancient houses. At their head rode a grim and powerful figure, Dane Ironfoot, Thorin's kinsman and lord of the Iron Hills. He had answered Thorin's call, bringing 500 hardened dwarf warriors with him. They had come for battle. The camp of men and elves stirred with unease. Thranduil's green-clad soldiers took up their weapons, and Bard's men stood ready. This was not what they had wanted. They had come to seek peace, but now it seemed the mountain would be bathed in blood. The dwarves of the Iron Hills were not to be taken lightly. Short though they were as strong as stone, with axes sharp enough to cleave even the stoutest armor. If it came to war, it would be fierce and terrible. Inside the mountain, Thorin's spirit soared. His kin had come. His pride and stubbornness, once edged with doubt, now grew into full defiance. He believed himself beyond challenge, beyond question. He would never yield now, never share his treasure. Let the men and elves try, they would not take what was his. He stood upon the battlements of the gate and called down to Bard and Thranduil. "You are too late," he declared. "My kin have come, and my kingdom is secured. If you wish to take my treasure, you shall find only steel waiting for you." Bard's face darkened. "Thorin, son of Thrain, I ask you one last time, will you not share a portion of the wealth that lies within your halls? Will you not give to those who suffer?" Thorin's answer was cold. "I owe you nothing. Begone before my patience is spent." There was nothing more to say. The battle was coming. That night, as Thorin stood among his horde, his mind was consumed with thoughts of war and victory. The gold gleamed beneath the flickering torchlight, and he felt a strange power in its presence. This was his alone. He would defend it to his last breath. But even as he reassured himself, a small figure crept silently through the shadows of Erebor. Bilbo had made his decision. Slipping past the guards, he made his way toward the outer walls of the mountain. He carried with him a single object, the Arkenstone, wrapped in cloth. His heart pounded as he approached the exit, but he did not hesitate. He knew that if he did not act, Thorin would lead them all to ruin. The night was cold when Bilbo climbed down from the walls and walked quietly toward the enemy's camp. The elves standing guard noticed him first, their keen eyes narrowing at the sight of the Hobbit emerging from the darkness. He was quickly brought before Bard and Thranduil, who looked at him with surprise. "What is this?" Bard asked. "A messenger from the mountain." Bilbo took a deep breath and unwrapped the cloth in his hands. The Arkenstone shone brightly even in the dim light, its brilliance casting soft glows upon their faces. Gasps rippled through those gathered, and Thranduil's eyebrows lifted in curiosity. Even Bard, usually so composed, could not hide his astonishment. "The Arkenstone," he murmured. "The heart of the mountain," Bilbo nodded. "I give it to you," he said simply. "Perhaps it will help you bargain with Thorin." There was a long silence. Bard stared at him, understanding slowly dawning in his eyes. "You are a bold one, Master Hobbit," he said at last. "Why do you do this?" Bilbo hesitated. He did not quite know how to explain it, but at last he said, "Thorin is not himself. He has fallen under the spell of the gold. He will not listen to reason, but he desires this above all else. If you have it, perhaps you can reach him." Bard studied the hobbit for a long moment before nodding. "You have done a great thing, Bilbo Baggins of the Shire, and perhaps a great risk, but we shall see what comes of it." Bilbo sighed, relieved that the stone was out of his hands. He knew that if Thorin ever discovered what he had done, there would be no forgiveness. But he did not regret his choice. Perhaps, just perhaps, it would save them all. With that, Bilbo turned back toward the mountain, slipping once more into the darkness. As he climbed back into Erebor, his heart was heavy, but he told himself it was the right thing to do. Morning came, and the air was thick with the scent of battle. The forces of men and elves stood prepared, their weapons glinting in the pale dawn light. The dwarves of the Iron Hills formed their ranks, axes at the ready. It would take only one spark for the battle to begin. And then Bard stepped forward. Before Thorin, he lifted the Arkenstone high, its brilliance undeniable. "Behold, Thorin Oakenshield," he called, "the heart of the mountain. Will you still deny our claim?" Thorin's face twisted in rage. His eyes burned with fury as he beheld the Arkenstone in the hands of his enemies. "How?" he gasped. "How came you by this?" "It was given to me," Bard answered, "by one who wishes for peace." Thorin turned, his gaze sweeping over his own company. His fists clenched, his breath came in ragged gasps, and then he knew. He turned on Bilbo, his voice shaking with fury. "You," Bilbo swallowed hard but did not flinch. "Yes, Thorin," he said softly. "I gave it to them." The dwarf king was shaking with rage, his hand twitching toward his sword. His face was red with fury, his teeth clenched as if he might strike down the hobbit where he stood. You miserable little burglar," he spat. "You would betray me." Bilbo met his gaze, sadness in his eyes. "I did what I thought was right." Thorin's hand hovered over his weapon, but at last he turned away with a growl. "Get him out of my sight," he roared. "Throw him from the mountain if you must." And so it was that Bilbo Baggins, who had come so far and done so much, was cast out of Erebor alone. But as he walked down toward the valley, the storm was not yet over. For something far worse was coming. The mountains stood on the brink of war. The morning air was thick with tension as two armies faced each other in the Valley of Dale. On one side, the men of Lake Town and the elves of Mirkwood stood ready, their banners rippling in the cold wind, their weapons gleaming in the light of the rising sun. On the other, the grim and battle-hardened dwarves of the Iron Hills, led by Dane Ironfoot, had formed tight ranks before the gates of Erebor. Their shields overlapped, their axes gripped firmly. It would take but a single command for steel to clash against steel. Yet in the heart of the mountain, Thorin Oakenshield stood alone with his anger. His hands trembled with fury as he stared at the great hoard of treasure before him. Yet he saw nothing but the Arkenstone, his birthright, his pride, the greatest heirloom of his house, now in the hands of his enemies. And worse still, it had been stolen from under his nose by Bilbo Baggins, the hobbit whom he had once called friend. The betrayal stung more than he could bear. The treasure, which should have been his triumph, now tormented him with its absence. But he would not be undone. Dane and his warriors had arrived, and with their strength, he would drive the men and elves from his gate. He would reclaim what was his. He would teach Bard, Thranduil, and all who defied him that the king under the mountain would not be robbed. Outside, Bard stood firm, holding aloft the Arkenstone, waiting for Thorin's answer. His voice rang clear in the still air. "Thorin, son of Thrain, this is my offer. In exchange for the Arkenstone, which you so desire, grant us a fair portion of the treasure to aid those who have suffered. This is no demand, only a plea for reason. Will you not take what is rightfully yours in peace?" But Thorin's mind was far beyond reason. His face was twisted with anger as he gazed down from the walls of Erebor. "How dare you bargain with what is mine?" he roared. "You think to buy me off with my own treasure. You think I will grovel for what is already mine by right." His voice echoed against the stone, heavy with wrath. "No, I will not part with a single coin, not while I still draw breath." Bard's face darkened. "Then you refuse peace?" Thorin's eyes blazed. "I refuse to be cheated." He turned to Dane, his voice sharp as steel. "Stand ready. Let no man or elf set foot upon this mountain without tasting our axes." So it was that battle seemed inevitable. Dane's dwarves began to advance, their boots thudding against the frozen ground, their shields locked tight. The archers of Mirkwood knocked their arrows, their keen eyes watching every movement. Bard's men gripped their spears, their hearts pounding with anticipation. And then the sky darkened. A shadow fell over the battlefield, stretching across the valley like a great wing unfurling. A sudden chill swept through the air, and a terrible cry pierced the heavens, a deep, echoing shriek that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. It was a sound older than the mountain itself, a cry that carried the malice of ages. Goblins. Out of the northern hills they came, pouring forth in a black tide, their grotesque forms twisting in the dim light. Great wolves bounded beside them, wargs, snarling and snapping, their eyes glowing like embers. Above them, dark shapes circled in the sky, giant bats, their leathery wings flapping as they prepared to descend upon the battlefield. At their head, upon a massive warg, rode Balg, son of Azog. His cruel face was twisted with glee, his jagged armor smeared with the blood of countless foes. He had come for vengeance. He had come to slay the heirs of Durin, to grind the bones of men beneath his feet, to burn the lands of the elves, and to claim the wealth of Erebor for his own. The battle that had been moments from beginning was forgotten. Enemies turned into allies in an instant. The elves, the men, and the dwarves all turned to face the true threat. The battle of the 5 armies had begun. With a mighty roar, the goblins and wargs charged. They came in a great wave, howling and shrieking, their weapons glinting as they fell upon the valley. The first clash was terrible. The front lines of men and elves met them with a deadly volley of arrows. But still, the goblins came, climbing over their own dead, their twisted blades hacking and slashing. Dane's warriors, though weary from their long march, fought like demons. Their axes bit deep into goblin flesh, their shields held firm against the assault. The elves moved like the wind, their blades flashing, their arrows striking true. Bard's men, though outnumbered, fought with the fury of those defending their home, their spears thrusting into the ranks of their enemies. But the goblins were without number. Bilbo, who had watched the confrontation from the edges of the battlefield, now shrank back in horror. He had never seen such a terrible sight. This was no skirmish, no mere clash of warriors. This was slaughter. He wanted nothing more than to turn and flee, to run as fast as his legs could carry him back to the Shire, to his warm hobbit hole and his quiet life. But he could not yet. From his high vantage point, he saw the tide turning. The goblins were too many, their numbers endless. The defenders were being pushed back, step by step. Even the mighty dwarves of the Iron Hills were beginning to waver. If something did not change soon, they would all be lost. And then he saw him, Thorin Oakenshield. The dwarf king stood upon the walls of Erebor, his eyes burning as he watched the battle unfold. He saw his kin fighting, dying, and at last, the madness of the gold fell away. This was not the war he had meant to wage. This was not his fight, but his people needed him. With a great cry, he seized his sword and shield and turned to Fili, Kili, and Dwalin. "My friends, will you follow me one last time?" They did not hesitate. Like a thunderclap, Thorin and his companions charged from the gates of Erebor, their weapons flashing in the morning light. Down the slopes of the mountain they ran, straight into the heart of the battle, cutting a path through the goblins like a storm of steel. Thorin's fury was terrible to behold. He swung his sword in great arcs, cleaving through his foes, his shield smashing aside goblin spears. Fili and Kili fought at his side, their blades quick and deadly. Dwalin roared as he hewed down a goblin captain with a single mighty blow. They fought their way toward the enemy's leader, Bolg, the son of Azog, who stood at the rear of the goblin horde, watching with a cruel sneer. Thorin had but one goal now, to cut the head from the serpent. The battle raged on, and the fate of the mountain, of its people, and of Thorin himself, hung by a thread. The battle roared across the valley of Dale, a storm of steel, fire, and blood. The goblins and wargs fought with a mindless ferocity, surging against the dwindling ranks of men, elves, and dwarves. Everywhere, the ground was littered with the fallen, friend and foe alike. But amidst the chaos, one figure led a charge like no other. Thorin Oakenshield, king under the mountain, fought his way toward the heart of the enemy lines. His sword flashed in the dim light. His shield bore the scars of 100 strikes, and yet he did not falter. With Fili and Kili at his sides, along with Dwalin and a handful of loyal warriors, he cut a path toward Bolg, the great goblin leader who watched from his vantage point atop a massive warg. The goblins saw Thorin coming and rushed to stop him, but nothing could stand against his fury. His sword struck down goblin after goblin, his feet carrying him ever closer to his target. Fili and Kili fought beside him with fierce determination, their weapons carving through the ranks of their enemies. Yet the goblins were many, and the dwarves were few. Bilbo, watching from a high ridge, saw the battle unfold with growing dread. He had never seen such bravery, nor such tragedy in the making. He longed to call out to warn Thorin of the danger that awaited him, but his voice would have been lost in the chaos. Then, before his eyes, the moment he had feared came to pass. The goblins had been expecting Thorin's charge. A hidden force lying in wait among the rocks suddenly emerged. The ambush was swift and brutal. Fili, fighting at the forefront, was overwhelmed before he could react. Goblins swarmed him, their jagged blades striking down the young prince. Kili, seeing his brother fall, roared in fury and fought his way toward him, but it was too late. Even as he reached Fili's side, another strike came, and Kili too was cut down. Thorin saw his nephews fall, and something inside him shattered. The last heirs of his line, his kin, were gone. A deep and terrible wrath filled him. He let out a cry that echoed across the battlefield and charged straight at Bolg. The goblin chieftain, clad in black armor, met him with a sneer and raised his massive iron mace. The duel was fierce. Thorin, though wounded, fought with the strength of his ancestors. His blade struck Bolg's armor again and again, each blow ringing like a hammer on an anvil. But Bolg was strong, and his heavy strikes battered Thorin's defenses. At last, with a sickening crack, the goblin's mace struck Thorin hard in the chest. The dwarf king staggered, fell to one knee. Bolg raised his weapon for the final blow, but before it could land, another force swept into the battle. From the east, the sky filled with shadows. Massive wings beat against the wind, and the air was suddenly alive with piercing cries. The great eagles had come. They descended upon the goblins like a storm, their talons raking through the ranks, their powerful beaks snapping through armor and flesh. The goblins screamed in terror as their ranks broke, scattered by the might of the eagles. And in that moment, another figure appeared on the horizon. A gray-robed figure atop a magnificent horse, his staff shining with a pale light. Gandalf had returned. With the eagles and Gandalf rallying the forces, the tide of battle turned. The goblins, now leaderless and overwhelmed, began to flee. The wargs howled and scattered into the hills. The battle was won, but the cost was heavy. On the battlefield, Thorin Oakenshield lay dying. His body was broken, but his eyes still burned with the fire of his spirit. Bilbo, his heart aching, made his way to the dwarf's side. He knelt beside him, taking his hand. "Thorin," Bilbo whispered, his voice trembling, "you will live. You must." Thorin's breath was ragged, but his gaze softened as he looked at the hobbit. "No, my friend," he murmured. "This is the end of my journey." Tears welled in Bilbo's eyes, but he said nothing. Thorin took a slow breath, and then, at last, his pride gave way. "Bilbo," he said, his voice quieter now, "I have wronged you. I fell to greed, to madness, and yet you have always been true." Bilbo gripped his hand tighter. "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold," Thorin whispered, "it would be a merrier world." He gave a final, weary sigh. "Farewell, Master Burglar." And with that, Thorin Oakenshield, king under the mountain, was gone. Bilbo sat beside his fallen friend for a long time, unmoving, as the battlefield slowly fell silent. Fili and Kili lay nearby, their faces peaceful at last. The heirs of Durin had perished, but their honor was restored. The mountain was free. In the days that followed, Thorin was buried deep within Erebor, beneath the stone of his ancestors. And upon his breast was laid the Arkenstone, not claimed, but given to him in death, a token of the legacy he had fought so hard to reclaim. Dane Ironfoot, Thorin's kinsman, was crowned the new king under the mountain. Unlike Thorin, he had no lust for gold, and under his rule, Erebor would once again become a place of trade and prosperity. Bard, true to his word, received a share of the treasure, and he used it to rebuild Lake Town, founding a new city by the shores of the Long Lake. As for Bilbo, he took no treasure, save for a small chest of gold and silver. His part in the adventure was over. He was ready to go home. The journey back was long, but it was different now, quieter, lonelier. Gandalf accompanied him for part of the way, but soon enough, Bilbo found himself walking the familiar green roads of the Shire. And when he finally reached Bag End, he was met with an unexpected sight. His belongings were being auctioned off. For the world had presumed Bilbo Baggins dead. It took time to reclaim his home, but in the end he did. Yet he was never quite the same. He was still the same hobbit who loved his books and his garden, but deep down, he was different. He had seen mountains and dragons, kings and wars. He had walked with legends. And though the world moved on, Bilbo Baggins would always carry a piece of that adventure with him. Thus ended the tale of the Hobbit, but its legacy was far from over. J.R.R. Tolkien's novel, first published in 1937, became one of the most beloved works of fantasy literature ever written. Its rich world, unforgettable characters, and timeless themes of courage, greed, and friendship captivated readers of all ages. More than just a children's tale, The Hobbit laid the foundation for The Lord of the Rings, a saga that would redefine fantasy fiction. Even decades later, Bilbo's journey continues to inspire countless readers and creators, proving that great adventures and great stories never truly end.